All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christine Firethunder. I'm the Director of the Governor's Office on Tribal Relations. And today I am serving you as the BILJA Tribal Task Force. I guess we'll call me my lead. And then my lovely assistant, Cindy Patak, is on assignment right now and not able to join us. So the BILJA Tribal Task Force has been created to serve the state as a direct liaison to all the tribes to access the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act money. So the purpose of our task force is to assist all the tribes in bringing as much money as we can to enhance infrastructure. And of course, that is our goal, is to make sure that we get all of our roads, all of our broadband, forest health, electric vehicles. There's a multitude of things that are covered under the BILJA Act. So today's office hours is focused on long-range planning among multiple federal agencies, and part of that includes cybersecurity. So the Arizona Department of Homeland Security is the entity that is assisting in attracting more interest into cybersecurity. So we'll talk about how cybersecurity is important. And then the next part of that is data sovereignty. So we're talking about data and we're talking about access to information. There's always that question that comes up. What are you going to do with my data and how are you going to use it? So let's just take a step back and let me introduce you to our guests. Ryan Murray serves as the Deputy Director for the Arizona Department of Homeland Security, and he's also the tribal Are you one of the tribal liaisons there, Ryan? I can't remember.
So technically, no, that's Cheryl. She's our tribal liaison from the department.
Okay, great. So some agencies are extra large and they have more than one. So for example, DES has 6. Our next guest, Ryan Murray joined the Arizona Department of Homeland Security in July of 2021 and currently serves as the Deputy Director for Arizona Cyber Command and as the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Arizona. He also previously served as a Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Revenue for 3.5 years. So in his current role, Deputy Director Murray provides technical and operational leadership for Cyber Command and strategic advice to Director Romer, the State Chief Information Security Officer. Also joining us today is Candida Hunter. Candida Hunter serves as the Senior Director of Tribal Affairs at First Things First, Arizona. And Candida, don't you have more than one tribal liaison at FTF?
Yes, we have a tribal liaison there as well, Calvina Bolin.
Great. So Candida is Hualapai and Mexican and serves as Senior Director of Tribal Affairs for First Things First. In this position, she's responsible for ensuring the facilitation of effective government-to-government relations between FTF, a state agency, and Arizona's tribe, building and strengthening organizational relations with tribal partners, fostering tribal relations through collaborative partnerships, and facilitating the provision of culturally responsive early childhood services in tribal communities. Okay. You know, Candida, one thing you don't mention, and maybe it's further along, in your bio, is that you are also a former member of Tribal Council of the Hualapai Nation. So Candida brings us some rare experience. We don't have very many tribal liaisons who have also served as tribal leaders. So she's an asset to the state of Arizona. In her role at FTF, she has also put into place data sovereignty agreements. So we've asked her here to give us the heads up on what that means and what that looks like and what it could look like for your agency. So let me give you a little bit of context. Probably 10 years ago, we started introducing FirstNet to all the tribes. And basically what that is enhanced access for all the tribes in the event of an emergency. So if something emergent happens, they are able to access, we'll call it, Ryan, if you'd like to help me explain how FirstNet works, that would be super helpful. But it's
Yeah,
like they,
for sure.
okay, you explain FirstNet.
Sure.
Thank you.
So essentially, it's priority service for mobile devices that are on the FirstNet network. I believe it's T-Mobile that runs it, and essentially, or maybe AT&T. Sorry. Essentially, giving priority service for first responders, for law enforcement, for those who are helping to protect the communities. So if there is a major incident that's impacting 4G and 5G networks, any of those on FirstNet get that priority service. That way they're less impacted and have higher bandwidth and capabilities, so they can continue to do their jobs.
Right. Thank you. So when that happens, or when it first was being rolled out, we did a lot of outreach to the tribes and especially to the tribal police chiefs. And so once we started to explain what it is and how FirstNet would need access to the systems, that's when, red flags started to come up. What do you mean you need to access our systems? I thought this is something that we could join. So yes, you can join FirstNet, but there's this give and take that has to occur. And so for that reason, a lot of the tribes were hesitant to join. But now some of them have joined FirstNet and they have been able to mobilize resources, which was really effective during the pandemic and alleviated some of those concerns in communication. Obviously, there is still huge gaps in broadband access, which we're dealing with at a local level through the NTIA broadband grants. But what we're leading to now is that we've already started with FirstNet that was introduced from a public safety perspective. And then we started talking about broadband. And with broadband, we had some communities who were completely in the dark and others who already had established tribal libraries in their communities. And we were able to access online school and other online services through those service points. But there wasn't that broadband access into homes or for individuals. So that complicated things. But what we're really looking at is how do we protect those situations where you have to rely on a single access point like a tribal library. And for myself, I didn't actually consider anything like home security. And I mean home security, I'm talking about internet security. How am I protecting myself? And it wasn't until, the pandemic started that I really needed to be more cautious and aware of the data that was floating around, invisible, floating around, that people can just go out and grab. And those people that we refer to as hackers, right? So it's those type of situations that you need to be aware of. And so we're protecting ourselves at home. How are we protecting ourselves on a bigger scale? So in my house, I'm most concerned about protecting my children from online predators. And there's unfortunately so many that I regret that I have to even acknowledge it, but it's out there. So we go into my home and then we start talking about, well, how are the schools protecting themselves? And I don't know that question. And I don't even know how many tribal communities have actually thought to recognize that we need a cybersecurity plan. And this is where Ryan fits in. So Ryan, please share with us your experience, what type of activities the Department of Homeland Security has in place for cybersecurity awareness and prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you guys for having me on to talk again. I know I've presented to one of the BILJA conversations in the past about what we're doing as part of the cybersecurity grant that's coming down from the feds. And realistically, we know that a big part of BILJA this year is providing those cyber resources to SLTT, to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. And DHS, as part of that grant, is really strongly suggesting that states sort of take a look at this from a holistic perspective of how do they protect their entire states. And fortunately, Arizona has kind of been a bit ahead of the game on this, is in that's been our strategy for several years now. And I'll just quickly share my screen just to have kind of a visual here as I'm talking about it. But this is, let me know if you can see the screen. Look okay? Awesome. So this has sort of been our driving strategy for the past couple of years, is really looking at this from how we can help protect the entire state. Something that my boss has been saying a lot lately is that an attack against one of us is an attack against all of us, and that really we need to look at this from a collective defense across the entire state of Arizona, working together to protect each other, especially seeing that the most vulnerable of our communities are the ones that are getting targeted more frequently. They don't have the capabilities to protect themselves. They don't have the resources to respond and recover after a major event. So how can we all kind of come together and assist each other in our times of need? And as Christine mentioned, especially looking at how this impacts school districts, how this is impacting libraries and community centers, how this is impacting these organizations that have really never been online or providing digital services before, and don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to build cybersecurity into those capabilities. We've really seen how can we try to help those organizations that don't necessarily have those structures in place and that infrastructure in place to provide cybersecurity protections. So looking at this slide, this is sort of our 4 pillars of what we're looking at for the whole of state approach. On the left is Cyber Command, our team here at the Arizona Department of Homeland Security. This is the team that really runs all of these protections and provides them out for our local government entities. AZ-ISAC is our Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Those of you may be familiar with MS-ISAC, or the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Very similar concept, essentially collecting information on cyber attacks that we're seeing across the state and sharing with the rest of the community so we can better protect each other. And then our National Guard Cyber Joint Task Force is a partnership that we've been working with the National Guard, focusing on both preparedness and response efforts. So doing assessments, doing vulnerability scans, and then providing that information to these entities. And then if there is an incident that occurs, the National Guard team can respond and help recover from those incidents after they happen. And then the statewide cyber readiness program is a program that we're running here in our department, essentially started as a Homeland Security grant, providing cybersecurity tools to all of our local government entities. That has been significantly expanded this year due to some assistance from the governor's office and the budget office to provide some additional funding to essentially up-level this program to provide additional support to K-12 school districts and to the tribal nations, where we really didn't have that capability previously in previous years as part of this program. And that program is providing 5 tools to anyone that wants them for no cost. So that's security awareness training, advanced endpoint protection, and detection and response capabilities, web application firewalling, multi-factor authentication, and a product that we're calling converged endpoint management. So doing everything else on your endpoints, patching, enforcing policies, looking for sensitive data, that sort of thing to make sure it's protected. So all of that being said, we mostly just wanted to have a conversation with you since we have seen this large push from cyber threat actors to go after the most vulnerable, to just talk to you about, start a conversation. What do your cybersecurity strategies look like? What are your struggles and successes that you've been having? And what do those plans for building out your cybersecurity protections look like within your environments? And just have a conversation about, is there a place in the state, either through any of these programs or just an informal discussion about how we might be able to participate in that plan and that strategy. So with that, I'll just kind of kick it back out to you guys and just ask, what do your cybersecurity strategies look like? What are you seeing, and what do your struggles and successes look like over the past couple of years?
Well, Brian, one question that I had for you is that when you are doing your outreach to tribes, what is your pitch and what is the concerns that they raise to you about your potential partnership with your agency?
Yeah, really good question. So the pitch is basically, we have these things and they are free, and everyone says, are they really free? And we say yes, and they say, okay, what's the catch if they're really free? And we say there's no catch, which everyone is obviously very questionable of. The next big question we have is obviously cybersecurity protections, especially tools that have to be deployed in environments. Everyone is greatly concerned about what information is being collected, what visibility do we at the state have of that information, and how much access do you have in my environment, and what are you going to be doing with that information? So obviously, really great questions, certainly relevant concerns. The short answer is we're not going to be doing anything with that information that you aren't aware of and fully authorizing. We collect cyber attack information and we aggregate that to understand what the attacks and defense look like across the state, and then use that to understand where we can sort of better reach out to our partners to see how we can provide better capabilities. And then if they need response, if they need recovery assistance, we can go with that. But the short version is we're not doing anything. We're not sharing that information with anyone that you wouldn't be aware of prior to it happening. And obviously, having these tools in your environment is a significant. We'll say it's a trust that you would have to put into the state and to our team. And really, we see this as a partnership. We don't want this to just be us giving you these things and then essentially saying this is, we're going to be looking at your environment or whatever. This is something that we want to be able to provide as support and assistance to anyone that would like to participate in this. And we've already got, I want to say there's approximately 60 school districts that we're working with right now, providing these protections that have not been in place prior. And we know we've seen school districts especially getting hit with pretty significant cyber attacks recently. Ransomware, phishing attacks, other things, data breaches, those sorts of things that they just didn't have the resources to be able to protect themselves. And being able to see this actually provide defensive capabilities, positive defensive capabilities that they didn't have previously is sort of awesome to see.
So Ryan, one last question for you. If
Sure.
a tribe was to partner with you and do, I forget what you call it, when you surveil or determine where gray or dark areas exist,
Sure.
how do you identify those and what happens next?
Yeah, so in coordination with our team and our National Guard team, we've been doing these assessments across various cities and counties as well as state agencies, essentially just doing a vulnerability assessment or a gap assessment to understand what cybersecurity capabilities exist, what vulnerabilities exist in the environment, and then providing that report to whoever that entity is that we're assessing. The way the National Guard has done this and our team has done this in the past is we provide a non-disclosure agreement that essentially says we're not going to share this information with anyone else. It's provided to you for your benefit to attempt to solve these problems that have been identified, that it's not going to be shared with anyone else outside of your organization without your explicit authorization. And then we're there to help. So whatever effort needs to be put in to address those vulnerabilities, to close those cybersecurity gaps, that's what that information is for. It's not to be shared anywhere else outside of that organization. And this really ties in the conversation that Candida is going to start next, is essentially about that data sovereignty, right? That this is your data, and we're not going to share it. We're not going to do anything with it without your explicit authorization, because it is your data, right?
Awesome. That's actually a really good segue for Candida. Ryan, we'll get back to you. Candida, can you start by explaining where the genesis for the concern about data is? Actually, let's do a quick poll real quick by our attendees. So if you could raise your hand, who understands the challenges related to data sovereignty, or at least understands where the issue started for Arizona? Going once, going twice. Awesome. Okay, Candida, can you go over the brief history and then how your organization responds to the data sovereignty requests?
Sure. So I think, well, first it's just recognizing the history here in the United States of how government hasn't always been upfront with tribes, and where, we have a history of genocide, we have a history of acculturation, and so we have to really think about how has that history played into the use or access of data. And there's many times when I go to tribes and request approval for data, or I work with our regional directors to be able to do that. And one of the questions that always comes up, or something that comes to mind, is just we know that there was the issue regarding the blood samples with Havasupai and Arizona State University. And that is a way in which shows that the research that was done wasn't specific, that specific research wasn't to benefit the tribe, because the tribe already knew where they came from. They knew their creation story. So having somebody say this is where a community migrated from didn't help them at all. And so I think, it's important to recognize that there needs to be that reciprocity, there needs to be approval, and there needs to be, when utilizing data, a benefit. How does it benefit the community and not just an organization? So I'm going to go ahead and start with just sharing my presentation. I know we have a few folks in here. I don't know who's all from tribal communities and who's from state agencies, but if you'd like to share who you are in the chat, please feel free to do so. But really, my presentation today will be focused on providing you with examples of how First Things First honors sovereignty, and more specifically, tribal data sovereignty. So today, I just wanted to cover a few things. This includes a brief overview of our partnerships with tribes, defining tribal data sovereignty, and actually I should have wrote Indigenous data sovereignty, not tribal, and then how First Things First honors Indigenous data sovereignty. So let me just start with our partnerships with tribes. We know that there are 22 federally recognized tribes here in Arizona. And so when First Things First was created, it recognizes that in the statute, but it also had in there that tribes can determine how they would like to partner or participate with First Things First. So currently we have 10 tribes who choose to partner as a region within their reservation land. So for example, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community participates as a region within the reservation lands, and then 9 tribes who participated as a part of a larger geographical region. So for example, the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation participates as a part of a larger region, which is the East Maricopa region. And so every 2 years, tribes have the option to say how they would like to participate in First Things First. Recognizing the government-to-government relationship, one of the ways that we honor sovereignty includes our tribal consultations. Our tribal consultations, we now have 2 types of consultation. Well, actually, we have more than 2 types. We will engage in consultation with just tribes specifically on a matter that's important to them or to First Things First. But every year, with the exception of 2020, we facilitate a statewide consultation. And these consultations really help to inform our policies, practices, and process improvements. One example of that is we did have tribes say we would like to learn more about how First Things First investments are specifically impacting our communities. And so based on that feedback, we piloted regional consultations in 2017. And these consultations were really to recognize that First Things First has a shared governance. We have a state board who's setting the strategic vision and mission. And then they're making decisions on a statewide level. And then we have regional councils who are making those local decisions about what programs to fund for young children and families. So recognizing that we could build upon that, we facilitated regional consultations with several tribes to really learn about how First Things First can be better partners, what were the tribal priorities, what are those considerations for when programs are being implemented. We took the feedback from tribal leaders as well as regional council members to our tribal consultation to say, we piloted these, here's how it worked. Should we continue? And tribes said, yes, continue to do these regional consultations. We recognize you won't be able to do them every year or with every tribe every year, but to do these. So we began facilitating those again to learn more from the tribe so that our regional councils can help leverage resources, know what considerations what they need to consider as they are determining what type of programs to fund. And so we amended our tribal consultation policy to reflect our commitment to facilitating these regional consultations. Another example of that, and I'll speak a little bit more about this, is that we've developed a tribal data policy. So we recognize that we're utilizing data for a number of reasons, And we wanted to make sure that tribes were telling us how we appropriately do that. So within First Things First, we do have 28 regions with regional councils, and these regional councils are made up of local volunteers from 11 different sectors of the community. And they are really determining what programs to fund, how to build relationships to leverage resources. And currently the areas in which we're funding programs include family support, which could be a program like home visitation, where you have a home visitor come into the home and work with the family to teach a parent about child development and also help connect them to resources that are needed. There's also early learning. This includes Quality First, which here in our state, we have a quality improvement rating system, which really tells us what type of quality programs are providing for young children to be able to learn and thrive in. And so we have tribes participating in that. And then children's health, and this can include a program such as access to dental screening, varnishings, or also physical activity. I try not to use acronyms, so I'm trying to recall how to break it out. And it's nutrition, obesity, physical activity. And this is really helping parents to learn more about their child's health, types of foods, and also exercise. So those are some of the programs that are funded within First Things First. So I'm going to switch gears now. And at any time, if you have any questions, and I apologize, I forgot to check my chat. And hi, Cody from State Parks and Trails. Glad you're here. Appreciate it. So I'm going to switch real quick to talking about data sovereignty. And I think what's important for us is that we know that there is data sovereignty, and that this is really recognizing that people have rights and regulations to their data. And so I really like to utilize the definition that was provided by the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which really was established at the University of Arizona. But the way they define this is Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. And so that's really the basis from when I'm talking about how First Things First is accessing and utilizing data. Is I like to go back to this definition here. So keep that in mind as I'm sharing some examples of how we're honoring tribal or Indigenous data sovereignty. So First Things First, as I mentioned, we have 28 regions. 16 of those regions are working with tribes. We have 19 tribes who partner with First Things First. So we're utilizing data for a number of different reasons. This includes the Needs and Assets Report, which is where we conduct, and I'll talk some more about this, but we conduct these reports that really paint a picture of what's occurring for young children and families in regions and communities. Our strategic planning, this is us establishing our 4-year plans of what the regional council is going to focus on. Our grantee implementation, this is when the work is being, programs are being provided to children and families. Research and evaluation studies, we do these on programs, as well as if a region is interested in learning more. Let's say, for example, they want to learn how to support grandparents, or how many grandparents are raising their grandchildren, as they might conduct a survey in their communities. Population data from partners, and I'll provide an example of that later. And then our kindergarten school readiness. So how do we show that these programs funded for young children are really benefiting children in the long run, or seeing those long-term outcomes? So those are the ways in which we're utilizing data. And so in honoring tribal data sovereignty, is I wanted to provide 2 examples of how we're doing this. And so every 2 years, we conduct a regional needs and assets report. Every other year, we do what's called our long report. And in these long reports, we're utilizing data from federal, state, and tribal data. And so we're requesting approval for the types of data that are being utilized. As we're going through the tribal approval, we follow each tribe-specific process. So we do not take a cookie-cutter approach, which I think is really important, because as a state agency, we have timelines and deadlines we're trying to get things done by. And so in order for us to meet our timelines, we also have to recognize, well, what's the tribe's timeline? Sometimes it can take us a month to request approval. Other times it can take us 6 months. And that just really depends on what each tribe's process is. So we keep in mind that process as we're trying to move forward our approvals. The type of approval really depends on the tribe. Some tribes have MOUs that have been established for multiple years. Others, we go and request approval every 2 years. But in this long report, as I mentioned, we're utilizing state, federal, and tribal data, is that our regional councils look at what's the data that we want to request, and then we put those sources in there. So the tribe knows what data we're requesting to access. We're not just a free for all. This is the specific data, and this is the why. In terms of the data collection, as I mentioned, federal and state sources, those are usually publicly available. So we're able to access that. But we also, in terms of the tribal data, because we're requesting from specific tribal programs, is we make sure that we have a point of contact that's been identified. Who is it that we connect within the community to request this data? Sometimes it's a tribal administrator. Other times it might be a director of a child care program, or a regional council member who is serving might be that point of contact to help facilitate that. We also, too, it's not first things first that is collecting this data. The regional councils choose a vendor. And for most tribal communities, the University of Arizona has been that vendor. So we make sure that in our approval, we're identifying that vendor, or in a case where the tribal approval moves forward before a vendor has been identified, in that agreement, it says that we come back to say who the vendor is. But we also help facilitate that relationship with our vendor, especially if they're new. And then another part is data discussion. So our vendor is going out, accessing this data, brings this data back. And before they even write a report, we're asking the tribe, we're inviting the tribe as well as our regional council members. They come together to say, what does this data mean? So a reason why I think this was really important is because when we started doing this process 4 years ago, I remember being in a specific discussion where they said, there's a decrease in breastfeeding within the community. Why is that? And so, the community said, well, we have more grandparents raising grandchildren. So that's the reason why, a part of the reason why that, that's the case. And so being able to have that local discussion and folks being involved helped to inform the report before it was even written. And so that's another important piece that happens. And then the report review. So again, each tribe has their own process, and what's in their approvals may look different. So with some tribes, they state that there is going to be a 30, 60, or 90-day review of this report when it's written. And then some tribes say, review and approval prior to publication. Other tribes say 30-day review prior to publication. So we have to make sure that internally we're following what each tribe's process is. Another example is that I mentioned earlier, we're funding programs in family support, health, and early learning. And so in order for us to know how these programs are impacting specific populations, in 2019, we began requiring our grant partners to submit participant level data. What the caveat that we have to have tribal approval if this data is reported to First Things First, or submitted to First Things First, I should say. So in 2019, we began receiving participant level data for home visitation, parenting education, and oral health services. So as we were having these discussions with tribes, we really had to keep in mind, how is this participant level data benefiting the tribal community? How are we making sure, not just with participant level data, but with all data, that we have security and who's being able to access it and how it's being reported? And so when we were meeting with each tribe, we were first talking about, or having to think through, well, who's implementing the program? So for example, in some regions, the tribe may have a government agreement with First Things First to where they're implementing the program. So of course, they're the ones who are reporting and accessing their data within their own systems. So we talk about, is that information that can report it to First Things First, the participant level data. And then we have other programs that may be implementing the service. So for example, we might have a nonprofit who's implementing a home visitation program in a tribal community. And we're talking about what type of data system are they utilizing? And then also, how are they reporting it? Because some programs also have, because they're evidence-based, is the specific type of model may require that their data systems are utilized. And so we've been able to work with models to say, if the tribe doesn't want their data to be shared with this model, then we put that in place. And so I think that that's been really nice, is that we've been able to be flexible, recognizing, data sovereignty of the tribe and what they want and how they want their data to be stored and utilized. So within the agreement, we have had tribes who've said, we think it's better for us to have an agreement with the specific entity that is implementing the program versus First Things First. So when that happens, we help to start that conversation, and they talk about, what the program is, how it'll benefit the tribe, and then include in there what type of data that they're requesting. Because one is that they may have all these data fields that they're, going to be collecting, but it's really up to the parent or caregiver to say, I want to give you this data or not. And so there's different levels of consent that are happening, because you have consent of the participant who's saying, I'm going to provide this data information or not. And then you have the approval from the tribe to say, we approve that this data is being collected and then reported out. So one important thing to keep in mind too is that with all of the data, we never report participant level data. So we recognize that there are some tribal communities that are very small that we're able to say, oh, I know that family, or I know, this person. And so we want to make sure that no one is able to be identified, which is why we only report data in the aggregate. So some things I just wanted to share is that based on tribal, tribal consultation and First Things First experience with requesting or accessing and utilizing data, is that we developed a tribal data policy. And so this policy really helps to guide the framework for how we're requesting approvals. We've also developed MOUs, because we had tribes who said, especially for the regional needs and assets reports, is that, rather than coming back every 2 years, let's enter into an agreement where we have 4 years, 6 years of this is what's going to be approved. And so that has really helped us, because not only has the MOU, benefited First Things First and having our checks and balances, but it also too helps us when tribes have elections, and then when there's a change in leadership, because we have this MOU that we can go back on to say, here's what we, agreed upon in the past. Here's how First Things First is working, engaging with the tribe, and then seeing if that still works or if things have changed, because that happens too. So within the MOU, we talk about the types of data collected. I've shown that image earlier of how we're utilizing data or why we're requesting data, but also we lay out really the 3 big reasons, which is the regional needs and assets reports that are conducted, also program implementation data, which goes back to that participant level data. And then third can be the research and evaluation, because we might look at how effective is this program, or as I mentioned earlier, a region may want to look at how our grandparents, how do we support grandparents raising grandchildren? So we put in there those parameters, and then we work with the tribe to say what works, what doesn't work. And some tribes who have ethics or research and review boards, they may say, don't even put this in there, or we don't even put it in there, knowing what the tribe's process is and what may not be appropriate. So we also, I think that goes to the purpose of the scope as well, as we identify, again, here's why we're utilizing this data or why we're requesting it, and then having the responsibilities of the parties. So I mentioned earlier, identifying a point of contact. Also to, when we're in these areas of regional needs and assets report, research and evaluation, and program data, is we put in there what first things first is going to do. So for example, we may, our regions, our state board usually approves who is going to be implementing a program or who received the contract to do that. And so when they do that, we want to make sure that we're either including those parties in that agreement, or if the tribe approves it early based off of the relationship, then we go back to the tribe to say, here's who was selected to implement these programs. And then again, just the term of, here's how long this MOU is in existence. And one thing I don't have mentioned here, but I think is important, is contractor limitations. So I mentioned earlier that if the tribe isn't implementing the program, we may have a nonprofit who is implementing that. In these MOUs, we also state that the contractor has limitations in how they can utilize the data. So they cannot utilize this data in any research. They must request approval from the tribe. And so that's really important too, because it's recognizing, again, the data sovereignty and the tribe's right to regulate all research and data collection in their communities. So I will, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I'll be happy to answer any questions or share additional information. And again, I'd be happy to meet if we have anybody from tribal communities or state agencies who'd like additional information.
Thank you, Candida. That was really awesome. You talk really fast, so I had to pay really close attention. I have a few questions. First, I'm going to let anybody else who's on the call ask first. Kelly's got to jump off. All right. So before I started asking questions, does anybody else on the call want to ask or add anything to the dialogue? Going once, going twice. Okay. So Candida, you mentioned early on in the beginning that one of your slides, you should have used the word indigenous over tribal. Why?
Oh, good question. So I think the reason why is just because indigenous is recognizing that, and I'll say here too, is that we talk about tribal as in the 22 tribes, but there could be people here that live off reservation. We know like over 70% of people live off reservation. And so when we're talking about indigenous, it's that whole collective of people here in our communities. So that's why I should have used indigenous, but I still have, I'm going to say, a habit of saying tribal. And so I'm working too on changing that language. And even in our policies, we still have tribal, and it's a discussion internally that we're having. So thanks for that question, Christine.
Sure. What exactly does the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network do?
Yeah, so they were actually Stephanie Carroll Rainey and Desi Rodriguez. They're both researchers, and what they've done or they created is they were recognizing, that indigenous data sovereignty is important. And so this network is really a bunch of folks who can come together and work and learn from one another about how you support and how you honor indigenous data sovereignty. And they also have, I'm not too sure if Desi still has a class, but I know that Dr. Stephanie Carroll Rainey does have a class about indigenous data sovereignty. And I attended it with both Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Carroll Rainey facilitated that a couple years ago.
All right. And ASU also is it they're doing research in Indian country?
Yeah, that's actually coming up. I think it's on the 16th that they're going to be having a session about, I haven't seen the agenda yet, but they also do some work too.
Right. So I think and as far as I know, ASU was the first ones to put together a workshop focused on doing research in Indian country, because you do have to do data collection, especially when you're at an academic institution and you need information. And it's always coming back to, what are you going to do with that information? And I'm sure, Ryan, that's a problem that you've encountered it as well. So how, I don't know if you have any partnerships in place. Have you addressed data sovereignty, or even said, we're happy to put in writing that we're not going to sell your information to the Russians? And I'm being facetious because I know you're not going to sell it to the Russians. But just as an example, worst case scenario, you're obviously not going to do that. But sometimes people need that in writing because there's always that one bad actor out there. Okay, so Candida, I don't remember what the number of the slide was, but I think the most important slide mentioned that you had 5 different things: the tribal data policy, the type of data to be collected, the purpose and scope, the responsibility of the parties, and the term. And then last but not least, the contractor limitations. And I think that's probably really super relevant for all of us, because in the times that we're in now, even I'm having a hard time hiring people. So we have to subcontract out to contractors and consultants. Does anybody on the call have any questions? Okay, so this is something that we need to consider moving forward, because when you're doing your outreach and activities and you're asking for information or even participation, it may just come down to answering the simple question: what are you going to use the data for? How are you going to use it? And are you going to share it? So Ryan, do you have any final comments that you'd like to make to the group?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just echo what Candida said, right? Transparency is key to build trust. If you're collecting a ton of sensitive information or data and not telling people the true nature of why you're going to be using that data, that sort of destroys everything we're trying to build, right? So just being upfront about saying, one, what do we have access to? What are we going to be doing with this data? And then ensuring that everyone is in agreement of what that looks like, that we'll have access to your systems or we won't, that we'll have access to the data that's being collected or we won't. How is it going to be utilized for, bigger reporting capabilities, for aggregate data roll-ups to wherever it's going to go, whether that's sharing with other members of the community, with federal partners, with, the governor's office, or whoever that looks like. Being upfront and honest about everything that's going to happen there, and then building that into the conversation. That would just be my sort of final thoughts. And I'd again love to hear from anyone else out there in the community on what they think about what this looks like.
Hey, Ryan, one last question for you. And without violating any privacy of groups that you've already done assessments for, can you give an example of when you've done an assessment and what you found?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd have to go back and look at my notes and see exactly how many we worked with the National Guard in doing assessments of, but essentially they'll go in and do a vulnerability assessment, do some scans, look to see how many vulnerabilities exist in the systems, in the environment, and misconfigurations, those sort of things. And then we'll do an out brief. And something that Colonel King, who runs the National Guard team that actually does the assessment, is very fond of saying is he doesn't report to me. He doesn't sit in my chain of command, so he's not required to share any of this information with anyone besides the person being assessed or the organization being assessed. So it is completely on them to decide if you even want me to be there or anyone else outside to share this information with. And that's written up in a non-disclosure agreement that essentially says, this is your data. You're the one that has full control over this. We're not going to share it anywhere outside of your organization unless you explicitly say, please do this. So what that looks like is it's a list of, critical, high, medium, low vulnerabilities that exist in your environment, what the exploits to be able to take advantage of those vulnerabilities look like, and what the level of effort is, and then sort of a step of remediation to fix those things, whether it's patching certain systems, reconfiguring things to make them less vulnerable, that sort of thing. And then that sort of outline of steps of how to fix the problems that they find.
Okay, and so is the report provided to the requesting entity on those vulnerabilities?
Correct, yes.
And then they decide what the next steps are, or, okay.
Yep, they decide if they want to reach out to anyone else for assistance in addressing those vulnerabilities, if they just want to take care of them themselves. if they want to have a reassessment done in 6 months or 12 months or something like that to see if they've addressed the issues. But it's completely up to them what they want to do with it next.
Okay, and then this goes hand in hand with broadband. So those of you who are involved in broadband or at least have some reach to broadband, please make a note of this, because Ryan and I were talking before and it goes hand in hand. So whether you're doing outreach, you should also be talking about addressing your cybersecurity mechanisms, or even just, Ryan, is it possible for the tribes to just do outreach to say, we would like an assessment and see what we need to do next?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you like, I can put my email address here in chat, and I imagine we can share out slides and notes. And of course, this is all being recorded afterwards. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, I can certainly put you in touch with our team and the National Guard team that does those assessments.
Okay, great. Len, did you have a question?
Yep, I did. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, Ryan, I was going to ask kind of what you were getting at is this is a one-time assessment. And then when you determine the vulnerabilities in their system, is it up to them to do something on a sustaining basis to mitigate those vulnerabilities?
Correct. And we can certainly put together a mitigation strategy to say, like, look, here's the vulnerabilities we found. Here's how these got here in the first place. Here's some step-by-step processes that you can take ongoing to make sure that these vulnerabilities don't come back. Or if this is maybe like a patching process that's gone awry, here's some step-by-step processes. Here's some tools that we can give you to make sure that you can continue to do this ongoing into the future. One of the biggest ones we found is that some of the smaller entities that we've done assessments of, they just don't have the tools to, one, be able to do vulnerability assessments, so they don't even know how vulnerable their environment looks. And then two, they don't have the tools to be able to fix those vulnerabilities on a recurring basis. So those are two things that we can provide to them as part of the cyber readiness program, that if they don't have those capabilities currently in place, the Guard team could come in and say, here's the assessment, here's what we found. If you need help with this, go talk to Ryan. He and his team can provide you the tools to make sure that this stuff doesn't come back.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, great. Anyone else have any questions for Ryan? No? Okay. So Candida, Ryan, thank you so much for your time and effort. I will get back to you and doing future outreach initiatives. Candida, thank you so much for your time and energy. Would you have any final comments for the group?
Yeah, I'll just say that, thanks for being here and for listening. I do think, again, there are just a number of ways that we can honor sovereignty, and one of those ways is through, data sovereignty. And I know that we talked a little bit about ASU, and we didn't go really into detail of that, research study, but I do think it's important to recognize that today data is still being misused in tribal communities. And an example of that is last year there was a birthing center in Albuquerque, and this was reported in a local newspaper, but there was a birthing center that was utilizing COVID data that was being collected by one of the pueblos nearby. And so what would happen is when a mother would come in, they would ask, where are they from? And so when women were from that specific pueblo where there was a high number of COVID cases, is they would take the baby away from the mother when the baby was born. And so we're talking about, that connection, that bonding that's happening. And here was a tribe utilizing their data to help them make decisions for their community. But then you had an entity who was reported to be misusing it. And so I think that's why it is so important for us to recognize that and to be transparent with tribes about how we're utilizing data, why, and more importantly, how it's going to benefit their community. So, thank you.
Yeah, Candida, and to add to that, I ran into a group who was offering free STD testing to tribal community members. And then the tagline that she mentioned to me, and we're happy to sell you the data. Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's exactly what I said. Like, it's been great talking to you. Good luck with that. So yeah, it's real. It still continues. So please be sensitive to how you're using that data. Last but not least, ASU. ASU is a good entity, okay? They strive to do good work, and unfortunately there was a bad actor who tainted their research quality for a very long time. So they did and have been making reparations. I guess it's like 25 years now on that. And it's just one of those things that if you aren't acting in an honest and transparent way, things can take a dark and ugly turn, and you will never be able to recover from it. And that's kind of the situation where ASU is right now. They have made their reparations and they've done extensive work to right those wrongs. But that for that particular tribe, they've been burned. And now they are ultra protective of their community, and rightly so. But this goes back to the 101 presentation, right? We don't want to be another crease. We don't want to add to the problems. We want to make sure that we are making honest efforts to do a good partner and be a good neighbor. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we'll just end with that and we will move on. And thank you again, Ryan and Candida.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Good to talk to you.